With 95% of the world's supply chains existing in companies of over 1,000 employees, organizations must use a complex network of systems and processes. As such, today we're going to discuss just how bureaucratic these organizations are and what we can do to make practitioners more efficient. So Johannes, as a proud Frenchman, you must have your understanding of the world of bureaucracy. So why is it such a problem for our supply chains?
I mean, it's not only a problem. It's also, part of the solution. It's just the type of solution that you get comes with I would say problems of its own. So the way I see it is at first, the way I define supply chain, as I do in my lectures, as the mastery of optionality in presence of variability when considering the flow of physical goods. If we take that as the definition for supply chain, which clearly set it apart from logistics and operations, supply chain is very much about the abstract decisions. It is not about how you can actually run the warehouse, run your fleet of trucks. No, it's about the sort of strategic decision that the company is making, which, by the way, if you don't have people on the ground to actually implement and execute, then you can't do anything. However, supply chain is very much geared toward this high-level decision-making process, which are essentially the decision that governs what you're going to purchase, what you're going to transport, what you're going to produce, etc., and when, etc. And thus, because of the focus on those abstract elements, those abstract decisions, what you invariably get is, one form or another, is a bureau. A bureau that just, where the only output of the bureau is paperwork. And I mean, obviously, nowadays, it's digitalized, but the old metaphor of the bureau producing, where the only, I would say, output of the bureau was actually papers, bundles of paper, still kind of apply. That is what the supply chain is actually doing. And it has real value, because if you don't know when you should buy, when you should produce, at what point, at what price you should be selling, where do you want to allocate all your assets, if you don't take those the best decision that you can take, then it can mean that a lot of money and opportunities are lost for the company. So this has a lot of value, but nevertheless, you have a bureau that is fundamentally producing, paperwork all day long. Okay,
so what kind of organizations can this really kind of affect? Is it mainly sort of the very large organizations that kind of have these issues?
I believe it's, first, it impacts all the organizations that reach a scale at which the very notion of supply chain is meaningful. I mean, if you're like one store, one independent store, you don't have really a supply chain per se. You have a store, and the person who happened to be the primary inventory manager, accountant, and business owner is going to be pretty much the same person. However, if you start to have a supply chain, so potentially different sites, hundreds, if not more, of distinct products, and a lot of options on the table every single day about what do you produce, what do you buy, where do you, how do you organize your inventory allocation and whatnot, then very quickly, and I believe that all companies, when they are past, let's say $100 million turnover per year, reach a point where they need to have a team of specialists, so people who are full-time dedicated to this decision-taking process. And thus, you end up, whether you want it or not, with this bureau, even if it doesn't come with this specific name. You come with a set of people inside your company who are completely devoted to the management of supply and demand. And it takes many, I would say, the job titles varies. It can be category manager, inventory manager, demand planner, forecaster, demand and supply planner. But all of that are fundamentally the sort of specialized workforce that just emerge when your supply chain emerge, actually.
Like, it's funny because of sort of modern day organizations, they do everything they can to try and be as lean as possible, and they seem to almost kind of fall into this trap. So what is kind of the outcome then of having so many people that are involved in these decisions?
I mean, first, it's not a bad thing. Having people that are specialized is actually a good thing, because those people can do this bureaucratic work, but which is needed, because again, if the decision of what to produce is not taken, the factory is not producing anything. So somebody has to take the decision. It can be the plant manager or the factory manager that takes this decision, or it can be somebody else. And at some point, it makes sense that it's not the person who is managing the workers on the floor taking this sort of decision just because this person is concerned with tons of problems that have nothing to do with the exact minute details of the quantities of exactly what do we need to manufacture. This person has to make sure that safety first, that compliance and quality are enforced, that people show up on time, that etc. etc. I mean, a bazillion problems that have little to do with the micro numerical optimization of the flow, end to end. And thus, you end up, so it is very, I would say, rational and actually efficient to have this bureau, to have this emerge with specialists who are going to do that full time. And thus you will have that specialization of labor at play, and the prime benefit for company is higher productivity and higher performance. However, the downside is that when you have a bureau, the downside is that you have a bureau, and with the bureau comes all sorts of bureaucratic, elements of life in the life of the company. And thus you have like the emergence of a bureaucratic power in the company.
Okay, so let's talk about a few of those downsides then. I mean, what is such a big problem of having kind of this bureau that you kind of talk about?
The problem is with all bureaucratic undertaking, and this has been, I would say, documented in ways that are just hilarious by in the book that is called The Laws of Parkinson, and that was published, I believe, in the early 60s or something. And the idea is that essentially every single bureau or bureaucratic organization, and when I say bureaucratic, I don't mean that as a pejorative terms. I just mean something that has the organization of a bureau, one form and another. Again, it can be very useful, but it is a bureaucratic organization, and it is a bureaucratic because, in essence, people are not doing anything but taking the decision that will be implemented by other people, and that makes sense to organize it that way. But the downside, and they have been documented, is that essentially a bureaucratic organization always wants to basically grow, and ideally grow faster than the rest of the organization. This is literally and the reason are very simple, is that if you are a manager in a bureaucratic organization wants to multiply the people that he or she manage under, and thus you have like an ongoing pressure to basically add extra workforce to the case. And due to the fact that the work is bureaucratic, there is very little way to assess whether the need for extra workforce is real or not. And that has been true in literally all bureaucratic organizations pretty much forever. That was already something that was plaguing the Society of Nations 1 century ago. And there is even a very famous French novel called Belle du Seigneur that relate that, these sort of things where you have like those bureaucracies where a lot of people end up doing things that are pretty much irrelevant. And again, this is a side effect that you get with any bureaucracy. And thus, the thing is, I think the initial step is just to realize that those things cannot be eliminated; they can only be mitigated. And just to understand the sort of dynamics that are at play. So what do we have? We have essentially a set of people who are specialized in a fairly obscure task. That's what a bureau is doing. They are doing obscure stuff that the key reason why they are so productive versus having, everybody in the company doing the job, is that those people have mastered one way or another some kind of obscure techniques that gives them, an edge against the rest of the company. That is true, by the way, for compliance, legal, marketing, and whatever. It's when you have this sort of bureaucratic powers, it's precisely because they have mastered some kind of obscure knowledge or obscure practice that is fairly opaque for the rest of the company. And that's also due to the fact that it's fairly, the opacity is not necessarily, again, a desire to protect themselves, from the rest of the world, is that sometimes it's just very technical. Legal, for example, where it turned out that it's fairly opaque, but it's not that the legal department is doing things that are fairly opaque, is that literally legislations are fairly opaque in the first place. So there is that, it's just again, cause consequences.
So is that the reason why it kind of affects supply chain as an area, because some of those tasks are very kind of niche and fairly kind of complex?
Yes, exactly. I mean, if you want to for example, to assess the various kind of vehicle routing algorithms, which one are most suitable for your supply chain, for your fleet of trucks, assessing, word series of algorithms, it's a fairly niche, skill. Most people have zero clue on that, and if there is like a supply chain team and they make an assessment to assess, to benchmark the various algorithms that are known in the literature to pick the one that feels most suitable for the company, it turned out that this work is going to be completely, opaque for pretty much everybody who is not a complete specialist. And yet, if you don't pick an algorithm, that means that your routes for your deliveries, for example, are going to be dramatically inefficient. So you want to pick one, but you have to be aware that what is the amount of time that is reasonable to spend on this question? Should the team be spending 1 hour to pick, just to survey the Wikipedia, or 10 hours, or 100 hours, or 1,000 hours, or even, spend a whole decade engineering something that is, better? There is no clear answer to that. All those options are possible. Obviously, spending a whole decade is the sort of things that would only make sense for a fairly large company, probably a multi-billion company. But you see, if it's really something that gives you an edge, a bureau can decide, to spend literally man-years on a case, and it might be something very reasonable. However, it might also be something that is completely bureaucratic in the worst sense of the term, which is people are just, wasting time and doing completely nothing.
So what can be done then? I mean, it sounds like kind of certain supply chains are maybe quite inefficient. There might be a few kind of free riders, so to speak, in the organizations that aren't doing so much in terms of work during their working week. So what can be done to kind of weed out these people? What can be done to make these organizations more efficient in the time that they're spending?
Here, I believe that first is to assess whenever you have those I would say, those bureaucratic structure, and identify those sort of patterns, again, that have been very clearly identified by people like Parkinson in his laws of Parkinson, of identifies the emergent bureaucratic patterns in the negative sense, and that is, for example, when you have an element that is already kind of a bureaucracy. Let's say, for example, you have an s&op team, and those people want to go, I would say, start looking inward and want to add layers to their own bureaucracy. That's very typical of bureaucracies who are just, expanding their own intricate complications. And as a rule of thumb, it's very rare, in my experience, that there is any positive outcome for the companies at large when they are, undertaking that are taken this way. So you see, the danger is that when you have a bureaucracy, whenever this bureaucracy start to turn inward and start to, I would say, projects that only make sense from their own paradigms and own perspective, here lies the danger, because then you can end up with things that are really purely bureaucratic in the worst kind of bureaucratic, meaning that people are creating essentially fake work. And that happens all the time. I'm quoting, s&op because I believe that it's very typical, where you want to have everybody on board, and so you will have tons of meetings. And then due to the fact that you have tons of meetings, you need to have like meeting facilitators, and then you need to bring in consultants to streamline the whole things, and so you add even more people to a process that has already too many people. And then you have some people that are going to complain about the process, and then the solution will be to add those people to the process that was already suffering from an excess of people taking part to the process, etc., etc. So you see, that's the sort of flows where, hold on, when you see these sort of things that are happening, just cut it. I think one of the best ways to fight against, I would say, the bad side of bureaucratic organization or bureaucratic divisions, and again, my take is that supply chain has a bureaucratic core. It's both, you know, a curse and a blessing. That's the two are entangled. Is to make sure that you maximally expose this bureaucracy to the consequence that it generates, you know, good or bad. So you really want to make sure that those people who have who are specialists are really exposed to the good and bad things that they generate within the company. And if whatever, so for example, if you say, well, we are going to make sure that our, let's say, our supply chain scientists discuss with people on the floor in the warehouse once a month. Good, direct contact. That's not insane. That's not, you know, that's not bureaucratic. This is literally feedback loop and making sure that people are much more in contact. If you say, well, I believe that within the team of supply chain scientists, we should basically add a separate team that is only dedicated to numerical stability of the numerical recipes. I say, well, here you see you have you're creating a team that is most likely going to be very disconnected from the rest of the problems of the company. And it can give you an edge, but the danger is that this team might very well go completely, I would say, off track on problems that are very interesting intellectually, but completely unproductive for the company. And by the way, this is a danger that lies, I think, for whenever you have a division with very smart people. It is very tempting to have those very smart people tackling very difficult problems for arbitrarily long amount of time with very little to show for as far as the company is concerned. You know, those people suddenly they become like open researchers, and suddenly the very idea of delivering anything become kind of irrelevant. You know, they are just there because the problems are so interesting, but solutions don't even really matter. We're just here to try stuff and whatever.
So you mentioned a bit about S&op earlier. Like, would you say that bureaucracy is something that's changed over time, and now that companies are trying to use sort of more modern kind of management techniques, it's something that's become more of an issue?
I believe that a bureaucracy is what you need and what you get whenever you have specialized intellectual task involved. You know, you get a bureau. It can be a bureau with lawyers. It can be a bureau with a market analyst. It can be a bureaus of mechanical safety. You know, whenever you have some very abstract tasks that require some kind of specialized knowledge. 1 century ago, pretty much all companies had figured out that if you want to have a very high productivity in those intellectual undertakings, the simplest way to go about it is to say, we are going to take specialists, or if they are not already, if they don't have this special knowledge, they are going to join the bureau and acquire the special knowledge. They are going to cultivate this knowledge and become exceedingly good at it, and the company will reap the profits of that you get when you have people that are highly specialized in a specific topic. So this is very natural, and if you don't do that, the alternative is that you have incompetent people. So you see, the alternative of having a bureau is not that good. It means that you have just people that are smart and willing and incompetent. However, as soon as you have a bureau, you what you get is a bureaucratic structure with bureaucratic power play, which are suddenly, there is this temptation of the bureau to grow always, and that has been documented with the Parkinson's law. They want to grow, they always want to hire. You see, in a factory, when the job is done, it's done. If, for example, by 2 p.m., you've already produced all that you had to produce for the day, and you have your workers where you could say, well, you know what, we're done. We're literally done, yeah, you can go back home. There is nothing less to do. We had 100 units to produce. They have been produced. So if you are in excess of capacity, it becomes very obvious. You know, you don't let people play ping pong for half of the afternoon because there is not anything left to do. So you see, when you're dealing with physical stuff, for example, if you have deliveries to be made, once the deliveries are made, it's done. So there is like a finite amount of work, and you know when you're done. The thing with a bureau is that you never know when you're done. You know, there is always something that you can improve. You can always something that you can revisit. You have that's what you get with intellectual labor, is that there is no limit to the human ingenuity. You can always, you know, find something better, etc. However, the problem is that suddenly the idea of getting the job done becomes something incredibly blurry, and thus it might be very tempting to say, well, if we had one extra, you know, employee, we could do a lot more. So let's add this one person. And sometimes it's going to be true, by the way. But guess what? It's going to have a ratchet effect. You take 1% because you say, oh, we really need one extra person. But 6 months down the road, when objectively you're not under pressure anymore, and it's kind of, you know, relaxed, are you going to go back to, as part of this, you know, head of the bureau, are you going to get back to the board of the company to say, I believe we should just, you know, get rid of pay a severance package for one of the person just to, you know, streamline the team again? No. You know, with a bureau, if you have like the head of a bureau, and again, when I say head of the bureau, it could be head of supply chain, head of the division for mechanical safety or whatever, you know, it's of their nature that they are never going to go back to their upper management saying, well, I believe we should streamline the team and fire a few people. However, if you are running a factory and you see that you have half of the workers that are in excess, well, you're going to take action, and it feels very natural. However, you see, this is what you get when you have like physical labor. This is not what you get when you have like white collar labor.
Okay, if we start sort of bringing this together then, it sounds like there's kind of a sweet spot to kind of find, or in between kind of having that specialist knowledge and also kind of the negative kind of downsides of bureaucracy. So what advice would you give to kind of finding that kind of sweet spot?
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's a sweet spot. You know, it's just that you need to embrace fully the bureaucratic core, you know, of the supply chain, and really understand what it means, and thus create an awareness. Again, that's gravity. The problem is not that gravity exists, is that it's a matter of really understanding, you know, the fine print of what it entails, and thus it means that you need to have this culture where people are aware of the sort of patterns that happens to organization, bureaucratic, you know, division over time, and so that they can constantly, you know, fight it, and not just the head of this division or this other division. It needs to be some kind of a collective awareness. And again, I would suggest it's a very short book. You know, the Parkinson's laws. It's something like 60 pages or something. It's very short, hilarious. So it's a very straightforward to read, and so that you can identify ideas that sounds, you know, good but don't work, or invariably that are going to be that are going to be very bad. And also, another advice would be, think for companies that have been around for decades, how much of your existing staff is actually fully bureaucratic in the worst sense, or in the worst sense of the term. Try to do this honest assessment. I would say it might be perceived a bit as rude, but that's what is referred as bullshit jobs on Reddit or this sort of things. Just try to assess what is the percentage of people who are in your organization doing bullshit jobs. Jobs that are kind of meaningless, kind of that are not really connected to the reality, where whether they do it right or they do it wrong, it doesn't matter, and that are a bit like soul crunching. I can give you a hint. If you have armies of clerks who are spending 8 hours a day going through Excel spreadsheets, there is like high chances that a high percentage of that is actually qualified for this bullshit job, terminology. Thus, make this assessment and start discussing that. Again, those people don't have to be fired. Large companies have plenty of ways to reallocate people, retrain them. It's not about firing all the people who have those who have, I would say, ill-defined job position. Usually, it's not even their fault. They were only they have been hired and put them in this position. It was not of their own making, landing the job. So this is not only their problem. It's more generally the problem. And thus, my suggestion is cultivate awareness and try to have like a very honest, external as external as possible perspective on your own organization, and identify what would qualify for this sort of job, so that you can potentially, discussing that in the open, take action to diminish over time the amount of the portion of the workforce in the bureau that is not positively contributing to whatever the company is trying to achieve.
Okay, well, let's wrap it up there, but we'll probably check out a few of those jobs on Reddit now. Okay, so that's everything for this week. Thanks very much for tuning in, and we'll see you again in the next episode. Thanks for watching.